I want to read one verse to begin with. What's interesting about this verse is in this entire story, this is the only verse that isn't Jesus. This is Luke. These are words written in black. Now, you may have a hard copy that has words written in red. I'm reading from a words written in red copy. By the way, that doesn't make your Bible right and other Bibles wrong. I've heard that stuff too. These Bibles that don't have Jesus' words in red, man, find something else to get mad about. I mean, Jesus' words they didn't come out of his mouth in red. And so that was just a tool. It was just a study tool. So that's not a big deal. But if you are into that whole thing, this verse is written in black. What that means is this verse is Luke talking. Whereas the parable, which comes up in the next verse, is Jesus talking. And I only point that out. I'm not trying to be obnoxious. I simply point that out because of all of the parables I've read of Jesus, I don't know of another parable that says as much in the intro as Jesus says in the parable. That's tough to do. But I think Luke pulls it off. And here's what I mean. Luke 18:9. Also, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. And you might notice there's a colon at the end of that verse because the parable that follows is Jesus doing what that verse said Luke said he's going to do. What does he say he's going to do? A parable about those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and they despised other people. So before you even start reading, you already know what the parable's about, right? I mean, Luke gave you a description. He goes, here's a parable about this topic. And even in light of that, I still want to say be careful. Because even though Luke tells you what it's about, and you don't need to be a genius. Luke told you what you're about to read. I still say be careful. Because we'll oftentimes land on a character or land on an outcome, and there's more there than meets the eye. So let Luke lay out our three principles, because I think this is a three-principled verse. Look at the kind of people Jesus is talking to. 1, people who trust in themselves. 2, they trust that they are righteous. And 3, they despise other people. Now, if you didn't preach any other verse, which wouldn't be smart because you got a parable coming up that actually helps explain that verse. So we will read the parable, but not yet, okay? Because I want to lay some framework. I want to show you what I think Luke's laying out there from a New Testament perspective. And then I think it'll make it easier when we actually get into this parable that is pretty familiar. So let's deal with Luke's 3 points. People that trust in themselves, people that trust they are righteous, people that despise others. And I start by telling you this. Here's an overview, in case you forgot the Pharisee and the tax collector. It's a parable of 2 guys that come to the temple to pray. The Pharisee prays out loud. Boy, I'm glad I'm not like that guy. And the tax collector beats his chest, refuses to look to heaven. He's humble. And God ends the parable. Jesus ends the parable by going, which guy is justified? Okay, remember the story? 2 guys praying. 1 guy's self-righteous. The other guy's humble. 1 guy leaves justified. The other guy leaves condemned. Spoiler alert, the guy that looks the best leaves condemned. The guy that looks the worst leaves justified. It's not really a spoiler. You know where Jesus is going with this. He always sides on the side of the marginalized and the outcast. He's not going to swap it up right here. But what gets lost on us is this sounds like a parable of humility. That we think that what Jesus is trying to do is tell you, be humble in life. That the problem with the righteous man is that he's not humble. Righteousness has not made him humble. But I'm here to present to you that I don't think Jesus is giving you a humility parable at all. I think Jesus is giving you a religion parable. I think Jesus is warning you, not of pride, but of the righteousness that comes from those of us. I said us, and I'll actually just say me. I won't even include you. But for the guys like me who have used religion to define them, who have used being good old boy to determine that we're going to be blessed or determine that we're going to be anointed. I think Jesus is telling a religion parable for all of us religious people who take pride in our religious practices, who take solace in our religious practices. And he stacks us up against a publican, the worst of the worst. And at the end of the day, we're going to lose. And we know it when we read the parable that we're going to lose because The Pharisee's going to hide behind his religion, while the publican's going to have nothing to hide behind. And God, in the end, is going to demand that you have nothing to hide behind. And so we're going to walk away knowing that religion stinks and that the liberty is found in having nothing to hide behind. And then we can walk away with nothing more to learn in that except don't be religious. But no, there's more than meets the eye. So let's work on Luke's description, shall we? Look at the first one. This parable in verse 9 is about those who trust in themselves. Let me give you an idea about what the Bible thought, Old Testament, because we're living in a world in this chapter in which people are thinking in an Old Testament paradigm. Go to Proverbs chapter 30, and I just want to show you the Hebrew proverb book, a book of Proverbs that helped guide their day-to-day life. And listen to Proverbs describe that person that trusts in themselves in Proverbs chapter 30, verse number 12. There is a generation that is pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness. There is a generation, oh how lofty or arrogant in the Hebrew, how arrogant are their eyes. Their eyelids are lifted up. There is a generation whose teeth are like swords and whose fangs are like knives to devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. Now, I want you to just think with me for a moment about that phrase, there is a generation that's pure in their own eyes. There is a generation not washed from their own filthiness. There is a generation, how lofty their eyes. Their eyes are arrogant. We're not talking about the young people. When we start thinking there's a generation, we always think generationally. Those kids that were born in that year, or this generation that was born in that decade. This isn't what we're talking about, that there's a generation that's that way versus my generation that's not that way. Because if you noticed, the generation that's causing the problems is always not your generation. Notice that? I'll tell you what's wrong with this generation, but it's never what's wrong with my generation. It's always what's wrong with that generation. They're typically the generation younger than you, by the way. The generation that was the problem was never the generation above you. They were great. The generation that you're in, you had a bad break, but you know you're pretty good. The generation right below you, yeah, they're not too great, but they're not so bad because they came from us, right? It's the generation past that, those bunch of losers. They're the reason the world's going to hell in a handbasket because they've got this whole thing wrong. That's not the parables of the Hebrews. When they say this generation, when they said there is a generation, it's there are a people. And you know what? Maybe that people is me sometime, but there are a people who think their way is right. There are a people who lift their eyes arrogantly, as if they've accomplished something. There are a people who, as Luke said in Luke 18:9, trust in themselves, who think that they can figure it out. And so I don't want that to be them tonight. I want that for a minute to be us. I want us to own that sometimes we trust in ourselves. I don't want to point it off on another generation. Let us just consider ourselves that generation. Have you trusted in yourself ever that you could do it, that you would at least try first? Or how many of us, when we think that isn't us, because I know that sometimes we don't think that's us, but let me prove to you it is. Have you ever ended up in prayer and said, Lord, I'm desperate. I've tried everything. I need you to do this. Have you ever wondered why you bothered to tell him what he already knew? And that was, you've tried everything and now you're turning to him. Lord, I've tried everything. Now I'm turning to you. It's a little bit of an admission of, I thought I had it figured out. I had a bunch of stuff I tried. I threw everything but the kitchen sink at the problem. And now I'm down to, fasting and prayer. So if there's anything left for you to tell me now. And so we've all done that. In fact, it's kind of the default religious position. Help yourself as much as you can. Turn to the Lord for what you can't help yourself with. And I realize there's utility in helping yourself because you got to do what you can. But to trust yourself that you are the answer for the issue, well, we've all went down that road and it ends in disaster. And the book of Proverbs agreed.